that's kind of a cardinal rule in HR is it's unlikely to get bad. The problem is when it gets bad, it gets real bad real fast.
Hey, ambitious dentist, welcome to Start Your Dental Practice, the show for existing and aspiring dentists to take your dental practice to the highest possible level. I'm your host, Jonathan Van Horn, CPA and ABV, founder of dentistmetrics.com. In every episode, we aim to demystify the how to start a dental practice problem by bringing on world-class dentists, influencers, and consultants in the dental industry to pick their brain about how to get past the barriers involved from going from no practice to being a practice owner to owning your own successful dental practice.
When starting your dental practice, the list of things you need to do are virtually endless. So you got to hire your first employee, you need to set up your website, you need to find the perfect office location, and in all the chaos of getting things up and running, many dentists neglect one of the most important components of successful dental practice. It's human resources, and this is a big mistake. So while HR can often be complicated and overwhelming, the truth is not having the right foundation can really come back to cost you in your practice. There are plenty of things you can put off for later, but HR is not one of them. So today, I'm excited to sit down with Chris Lessard of CEDR HR. Chris is a California barred attorney and knows a thing or two about how to handle HR and successfully grow your practice. So Chris and I met at a CE event a few months back, and I just knew I had to have him on the show. He's a really nice guy and just really laid back, and is a fun interview. So his day-to-day role at Cedar involves advising dental practices all across the country about their specific HR needs. So here are a few things you'll learn in our conversation today. How HR affects virtually every part of your dental practice, Chris's definition of HR and why it's important, the secret to avoid costly HR landmines that could derail your practice, why it's so hard to remain compliant in today's fast-paced dentistry world, common mistakes new dentists make when making their first hires, and a whole lot more. I really learned a whole lot of cool stuff in this interview. I think you will too. And if you're feeling a little overwhelmed with HR, you definitely don't want to miss today's episode. So now, here's my interview with Chris Lessard from Cedar HR Solutions. Hello, ambitious dentists. So today we have with us Mr. Chris Lessard with Cedar HR Solutions. If you haven't heard of Cedar, you need to get out from underneath that rock you've been hanging out with and know that they are, to my knowledge, probably one of, if not the biggest HR solutions companies for dental practices out there in the nation right now. Chris is a California barred attorney, so he is able to play the law game over there in California, which is probably I would assume one of the harder states to practice law in. As well as he works with Cedar as an advisor to people that are calling in and helping people out with some of the questions they have about their HR. So I met Chris actually at a CE event back in, it was back in August of 2017, where we were presenting at the same place. And I said, hey, Chris, super nice guy. I think he'd be very relatable to my ambitious dentists that are out there. And I said, let's get him on. Let's have a discussion about HR, because I know you guys, if we're lucky, what the letters HR stand for. And if we're not that lucky, don't feel ashamed. There's a lot of you out there that don't. And so I have Chris on today to be able to talk us through a little bit about Cedar, HR in general, some of the common mistakes that people make, so that you guys may not make those mistakes in the future. So Chris, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris, tell me about how an attorney gets hooked up with Cedar Solutions.
Well, so it's kind of an interesting story. I am the product of the medical industry, believe it or not, because my wife is completing her residency here in dermatology. So I've been following her around since we both graduated law school and med school respectively. So I've gotten kind of a firsthand view of how hard it can be to make that transition from being in a residency, be it a medical residency or a dental residency, into private practice or even academic medicine. So we're living that right now. We're about to move to Philadelphia for her fellowship there, so fly Eagles fly. But that's where I got hooked up with Cedar. Is they do focus on the medical and dental fields in a capacity which was very relatable to me, but was also very convenient because I'm an attorney and all of the advisors here at Cedar are attorneys as well, but we are not a law practice. So what you get is all of the benefit of the knowledge and the experience that we get from earning our JDs, but you get it in a more relatable and more affordable package in the form of HR guidance and advice. So you might ask yourself, what's the difference between speaking to an attorney about HR guidance versus legal counsel? And that is a very good and very legitimate question. Basically, in a nutshell, the difference is we can tell you what laws may relate to you. We may be able to kind of safeguard and problem shoot against what may be coming down the pipe. And we can certainly provide the more personal touch in terms of the interpersonal relations between you and your employees. But as soon as there would be a lawsuit or something of a similar legal nature, or needing to set up some type of a contract or things along those lines there, we're going to defer to counsel that are barred and qualified in your state. But you get a lot of advantage because HR touches almost everything within a typical dental or medical practice. And if we can avoid seeing attorneys, that's what most people want to do anyway. So we kind of see ourselves as a value-added service there.
Well, people don't want to hang out with attorneys. That's crazy.
I like them, but I'm a little biased.
It's probably as much as they want to hang out with CPAs, I guess. So cool. So, as you're finding out with your wife, one of the things that they don't teach you in any medical school is how to be a business owner. So there's not a whole lot of, contract law or a whole lot of, understanding of what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing from a hiring or firing or management perspective. And so for the people out there that are in that camp, give me what is your definition of HR? Like, what is HR in a nutshell?
Sure. HR is soup to nuts. It is everything that you are going to need to be able to run and grow your practice. And that's everything from finding suitable candidates, so the hiring process, through molding them to be the types of employees that you want, some growth and expansion opportunities if you want to acquire other practices and how that's going to relate to team morale, and even ultimately termination or separation if we find that our team members aren't working out or they're not meeting the shared goals and visions of the practice. So it can be absolutely anything, starting from the hiring process and the pre-planning to whether or not it is wise to grow at this portion, more the business planning side of things, to ultimately termination and separation. And that's where Cedar kind of shines more than any other area, because there's a lot of risk involved in the business environment these days, certainly more so than ever before. So what good HR does is help you plan and strategize to avoid pitfalls and what we call landmines from time to time, to prevent very costly litigation, which really doesn't have a lot of merit in most people's practices, because most people aren't doing the types of things which the law really cares about bringing the hammer down on. Problem is there are so many laws that you need to be aware of and so many ways that you need to be compliant that it's never been harder than it is currently for you to remain compliant. And as soon as you make a misstep, it's something that an employee could report, and that's something that we want to avoid. So good HR planning is not about how many employees do you have or whether or not we should fire this particular employee. It's all about risk avoidance and risk mitigation. That's the name of the game.
So risk avoidance and risk mitigation, whenever you're talking about that, let's talk about that in terms of, someone who's just becoming a practice owner that's never hired somebody before. Mm-hmm. What are some of the pitfalls that people find themselves in, or some of the traps, if you will, that people find themselves in when they're making their hires? What do they do? What are conceptions that people typically think that they have to do versus what they actually? So let me rephrase that question. What is it that you see people think is the right way when it actually is the right way is somewhat different?
Sure. What I find, what a lot of our members have difficulty with is, especially when they're starting, being overzealous with their ability to say, I can do this hiring, I know what I'm looking for there. And it may be the case that if you've worked as an associate or something like that, or perhaps you're purchasing a practice from an outgoing owner, you say, I know these people, I've worked with them, I understand what it means to be a boss. So they either keep all of the staff on or there's very minimal loss. But there's a big shift between being an employee or even just being a student, because all during your dental or your medical schooling, all during your residency, you are a student. And there's a big difference between being a student or being an employee and being the boss. And so some of the pitfalls that I see are having too many employees to start or having the wrong types of employees. And that's a skill which is going to take some time to weed out, because you might say, I'll train on the job, or I'm only going to look for people that have the following qualifications. And unfortunately, HR, it's not one size fits all. There's going to be a lot of gray, very little black and white. But what I can tell you is, if you don't have the right team with you to start, and if you don't grow that team well, you're going to create more problems than simply whether or not you have enough patience there from a cash flow perspective. You're going to have internal problems as well. But that's just the meta, maybe the 10,000 foot view philosophically. Once you start getting boots on the ground, you realize just how many laws and how many areas you need to be compliant in. So it's not uncommon for me to ask our members, did you make sure that you had a 1099 or a Form I-9 for your new hires? They say, oh, is that the one where they give their driver's license and their social security card? And say, well, yes, those are some forms of ID, but you could accept other ones pursuant to the form. I say, yeah, I'm not sure. We might have those for everyone there. So I'll just make sure that we get them later. And that's a really simple, really easy way to be out of compliance. And especially in the current environment, there's never been more risk with someone double checking to see if everyone is registered to work for you in the United States. So small, simple missteps at the beginning can have big repercussions later. New hire reporting is another one. Most people don't know that you have to tell the state within a certain amount of time, typically 30 days or 20 days, but not always, that you've hired an individual. And you say, well, how do I do that? Who do I report to? It's a simple Google search if you want to do it yourself. But if you have a payroll processor like ADP or Paychex, they're usually going to do these types of things for you. But if you don't know that you are required to do it at all, then you don't know to look for those types of things, and the fines and penalties can add up very quickly. And if you say, Chris, well, if I have to report employees, maybe I'll just make everyone an independent contractor then, and we'll pay them a 1099. They'll be responsible for their taxes. That's a win-win. Understanding the basics of employment law as to what makes an employee versus an independent contractor is critical. And that is not something that they teach you in medical school or dental school. And that's not something that you can contract into or out of. You simply are an employee or are an independent contractor by operation of law. So you can't have employees or individuals agree to get a 1099. It doesn't matter if they're paid less than $600 a year. You need to make sure that you follow those formalities from the hiring perspective. And actually,
so as far as that, that process of determining if someone is an employee or an independent contractor, that's a question we get all the time at CPA.
Sure.
I know that there's, a multi-factor question, set that they go through and look for evidence of if it is one or the other, and it's somewhat subjective in a way in some instances, but it's black and white in others. What is your thought process? Because probably the most rampant version of people just saying, well, I'm a 1099 because or an independent contractor because I signed a contract saying that is for associates. What
Sure.
in your mind, what can make an associate independent contractor versus employee? I mean, just
Sure.
from your perspective.
And you're correct. There is a multi-factor test, and those factors will all be relevant in an ultimate determination as to the proper legal classification of a person as an independent contractor or an associate, i.e. an employee. But if you really want to boil it down as simply as possible, the way you want to look at it is, what amount of degree and control do I have over this individual within my workplace? Do I set their hours? Do I set their expectations? Would I subject them to disciplinary action if they are doing something inappropriate? Who is covering the malpractice and the tail insurance? Who's responsible for making the phone calls for their patients there? Are they doing the types of things which need to be done on a day-to-day basis, or are they specialists? So if you're a general dentist or you want to practice in general dentistry, but you know that you might occasionally need to refer out to endodontics or an oral surgeon. Are you having them come in with their own book of business occasionally for those very specific things? Or are you asking them to do more of the general day-to-day things that you would do as a general practitioner? So the more specific they do things, and the less likely those things are to be relevant on a day-to-day basis for your practice, is good. So if you're a general dentist, you don't really want to have another general dentist as an independent contractor. You'd really want to have more of an endodontist or an oral surgeon, but you want to see how much control do I have? And if the answer is, I really want a lot of control over this because I'm putting my business on the line, then it cannot hurt to classify them as an employee, follow the proper withholdings and deductions that need to be done, and formalize the relationship that way, because you're going to lose a lot of that power if you properly classify as an employee versus an independent contractor. And note that if you simply say, well, let's just see what happens if I classify them as an independent contractor. I've done it before. Nothing bad has happened previously. Note that states are cracking down on this. And this is something where, because you're not paying your portion of their payroll to the state has a vested interest in seeing whether there's been a misclassification. So just be careful and be wary. It doesn't matter how long they've been working for you. It matters how much control and the types of duties they're performing, to put it simply.
So what are the ramifications? What happens? You get a letter in the mail and you're up Schitt's Creek. What happens? Like how does that process occur? Because I'll be honest with you, I've never had that occur in the past 12 years.
Mm-hmm. So the odds of anything bad happening are usually pretty low. That's kind of a cardinal rule in HR, is it's unlikely to get bad. The problem is when it gets bad, it gets real bad real fast, because it's not going to stop with one individual. So they might go to the labor board and say, I feel like I was improperly classified as an independent contractor. And I believe in California on the returns, there's actually a box which basically says that. So as soon as someone reports something, or less likely, there's some type of an independent audit, they are not going to stop with that individual. And you will have to pay fines and penalties and accrued interest and all of that fun stuff. But they are going to ask you to open your books to make sure that things have been done properly with everyone else. And the odds are you're not going to have all of the information they want. You're not going to be able to provide the things that they need. And it is going to get expensive quickly as you try to unwind this situation and just try to get as small a tax bill as possible as a billing statement, but you're going to get burned. And so what we find here is, if we can prevent these things on the front end, if we can engage in good HR practices, which include things as simple as setting up employee personnel files. And you say, well, that sounds like a great thing. Why would someone not have a personnel file? Well, how you set it up matters too, because as a CPA, I'm sure the classic joke is they just bring a shoebox full of stuff and dump it on your desk and say, do my taxes. Well, the same is true in HR. If you don't know where the appropriate files are, if you don't know whether or not they were signed to acknowledge receipt of the document, if you don't know the last time they were updated, an audit can do a lot of harm very quickly. And it's not something that you can protect against. And it's not something you can threaten employees to say, well, if you bring this down on me, I'm going to fire you. Because of course, that's going to be seen as retaliation in the eyes of the law. So you'll have a separate civil suit against you in addition to the audit that you're already undergoing.
Yeah, that'll be bad news for you if you try to do it that way. I'm sure the court really enjoys whenever people fire people due to threat of litigation.
They'll try to find something else to call it. So very few people are going to say, you're fired for reporting me to the labor board. They'll say, well, you weren't performing well, or I don't need to give a reason. You're just fired. But the law is cleverer than you are because it's been around longer than we have.
Yeah. They've seen a lot of games. I mean, they know the way around. It's a lot like the IRS and the tax code. Like they know if you're playing a game, like pretty much all the time.
When someone writes the rules, it's a bad idea to argue the rules with them. Generally,
that's a great point. Yeah. So okay, so you've got someone who has taken over a practice, and they're hiring their first employees. They'll say, let's say they're acquiring a practice. I mean, this is probably a bit more specific, and this may depend on the state and things like that. But let's say that they're buying a practice and they've got 7 employees that they're inheriting, if you will. A lot of common, things I hear from other transition consultants is that you should have the old doctor fire them the night before you take over, and then you, quote, rehire them, unquote, the next day. Is that a good idea, or is that, does that make any difference? Or, I mean, what is it? What do you think?
And it is going to be situation specific, and you're going to want to see if there are any tax consequences for it or not. But generally speaking, the outgoing practitioner should have a complete removal of their staff from their books, i.e. a layoff or a mass termination. And then you hire on those individuals almost immediately thereafter. But that's where a lot of our members get into trouble, especially if they've acquired it because they were an associate and now they may partner and they're buying out another partner of the practice there. They keep everyone because they developed relationships with these individuals and even friendships in many capacities. But like I said, there can be a big burden going from being an employee to being a boss. And we can't simply hire on individuals because we've known them, we've associated with them, and we say, well, this is just working, so let's keep it going. I know so-and-so doesn't really do a great job, but it would be remiss if I let her go, but kept everyone else. You need to be looking at this through a business lens just as much as an HR or a legal lens. And so when you decide whether or not to hire these individuals back, having the basics on paper is important. So making sure that they fill out an application to prove that they want to remain in this job, giving the relevant job history, those types of formalities get you in the habit of doing them for new hires, but it also helps give you legitimate means to say, your numbers just weren't where we need it to be for the practice based on the payroll needs that I have and the needs to bring in income. So we do have to not let you go because I never hired you in the first place, but I am not going to be able to extend an offer of employment. And depending on how the purchase and sale agreement was written, that can help insulate you from inadvertent unemployment claims, which is not a fun thing to do in your first few weeks of owning a practice there.
There's nothing more fun than paying unemployment for somebody that's not even your employee anymore.
and the state loves getting unemployment. So it is something where the deck is kind of stacked against you. And if you say basically this was a layoff without an ability to be rehired, they're going to win almost every time.
So if you don't want to have someone follow with the sale, you just say we're not going to extend a contract to you, effectively.
And the word contract there, that's a really good word for you to use because it's the exact word that I would want you to avoid using, because almost every state in the country, Montana being a weird exception, is employment at will by default. And in a nutshell, all that means is you can terminate an employee at any time for any legal reason. And the flip side is true too. An employee can quit on you at any time for any reason. Sure. But you'll note that I said an important word for you as the employer, and that's legal reason. Now, you're not going to fire someone for an illegal reason, or I hope that you don't want to do that there. But everyone knows the basics there. You can't fire someone because of their age, race, religion, pregnancy, disability, those types of things there. But increasingly, what we have to look at and consult whether a termination is appropriate at this time is whether the individual has engaged in protected activity, like taking protected sick leave, which is becoming much more prevalent at a state and at a municipal level, or whether they filed a workers' compensation action recently, or filed a wage and hour claim. So it's not usually a question of, can I fire this individual? 99% of the time, the answer is yes. What good HR does is say, but should I fire them at this time? What are the risks associated with it? And what I would urge your listeners to avoid is calling an offer letter a contract, because we don't want to start muddying the waters with, is this an at-will relationship, or is this a for-term or a contractual relationship?
Okay, I see the difference.
And that's where employee handbooks can come into play as well. A lot of new members and a lot of new owners say, well, you're signing this, and this is the contract that we have with each other. And nothing could be farther from the truth. A good employee handbook is simply a series of policies that you as the owner get to create and enforce, but they are subject to change at your discretion, subject to state laws, of course, in terms of changing benefits, but it's not a contract, and you want to avoid the implication or the explicit statement, you are my employee for X amount of time, if at all possible, because you don't know what the future is going to hold.
Makes a lot of sense. So build an employee file. What type? So do you kind of use the handbook as a way to set what if there's any infractions that it would go into the employee file? Is that kind of like the guideline or the schematic of how the action should be occurring inside of the practice, or how does that work?
Sure. An employee handbook, for all intents and purposes, is the rules for the practice there. So kind of the map for how you want things to go administratively. And usually you're going to need to be more thorough than you think that you need to be. So Cedar's handbooks, for example, are about 52 pages long, give or take. And there's some white space there, but there are a lot of policies. And in our decade plus of experience, we found all of these policies are important. Now, your employees are going to go straight to what I call the pocketbook policies. Those are going to be your vacation and your sick leave and your leave of absence policies there, things that affect their pocketbook or their take-home pay. But you need to start with the basics of employment in a handbook. This is what it means. This is our practice vision. This is our mission, because that's important stuff. You need your employees to buy into that. But a good handbook is going to have all of the rules from an administrative perspective laid out in a clear and comprehensive manner so that your employees can understand it. Because if employees don't know what the rules are, or even worse, if they don't know that there are rules, then it is impossible or very difficult to enforce them, and it can make it harder to terminate employees for violations of rules that don't exist or are unclear. And so having it reviewed by an HR consulting expert or an attorney can be a very good idea. A lot of new members or a lot of new individuals straight into practice may say, well, I'll download it off of Google and I'll just kind of edit it to make sure that it's what I want to give. Or they might say, well, maybe I'll take it from my old employer, especially if there's been a practice transition. You're going to be bound by those policies until you change them. So I hope that you have your handbook in place day one, if possible, if you're transitioning. But a good, solid employee handbook are the rules of the road, and then HR administration done right is where the rubber hits the road and how we're going to apply the policies which are set forth in a manner which is fair, even-handed, and of course compliant with the law.
Hey guys, sorry for the interruption. Really quick announcement for you. And if you're going to be a dental practice owner, you're at some point going to have to get a dental practice loan, whether it's going to be to acquire a dental practice or it's going to be to start a startup dental practice. You're going to have to get a loan. And I'm really proud to say that a company that I've worked with personally dozens of times over the past few years is our first sponsor after 80 episodes of Start Your Dental Practice. And our first sponsor is Bank of America Practice Solutions. So whenever you're going to be getting a new loan, whenever you're going to get a loan for starting your dental practice or acquiring a dental practice, you really want to make sure that you have three things when it comes to that loan. Number one, you want a really great interest rate. Number two, you want to make sure that the company that you're speaking with has a lot of experience and can guide you through the best path to be able to become a practice owner through the loan process. And number three, you want to make sure that the terms associated with that loan are the most advantageous for you. And I'm really happy to say that all three of these things, Bank of America just knocks it out of the park for you. It's really no brainer. If you're going to have to get a loan, which you are going to have to do 100%, you may as well go with a company that has great interest rates, has great experience with the industry, and has the best terms out there in the market today. So if you're currently in the process of shopping loans, 100% give Bank of America Practice Solutions a try. And if you would mention that you came through the SYDP community, it would help out the podcast a lot and also allow us to give back to our very gracious sponsors. Again, this is an advertisement, a paid advertisement. If you go to them, I will, have more advertising revenue come to me. So if you enjoy the podcast, I would appreciate you helping out our sponsors. And if you are interested in that loan process, just text the word bank loan, one word, BANKLOAN, to 33444. Again, that's bank loan to 33444, and we will reach out to you. Thanks, guys.
Makes a lot of sense. So if you have decided that an employee you've had for a while, whether it be someone who you hired through being a new employee, or you inherited them through a transition, or whatever it may be, and you've decided that they are not a good fit for you, for your company, based off of your handbook, or based off of your, maybe they're not a great person to be around, their personality is awful, or whatever it may be. What is the way to move forward with terminating that position?
Sure.
Yeah.
What I would recommend you do before you move forward is look backwards. What do you have in their employee file which supports a decision to terminate their employment? Because the cardinal rule of HR is, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. You cannot prove that it happened. And if you can't prove that it happened, you will lose as an employer in a he said, she said fight. So what have you done on the front end to prepare for a possible termination? And I'm not recommending that you just pad their employee file with write-ups or corrective actions or poor performance reviews to say, all right, let's check these boxes here, but I know I'm going to fire them anyway. Good HR administration is do this across the board for everyone and make note of it. And it doesn't have to be a sample sheet of paper. You could do a notepad, you could do a sticky note, you could do an email to yourself. Anything which says, on this date, at this time, I spoke with this employee about this thing, and I told them they need to improve, is going to be sufficient. So look back in their personnel file to say, what have I done? Can I prove that I've tried to amend this underlying behavior? And if so, is now the right time for termination? But you need to be careful, because not everything in that file is a good supportable reason to terminate an employee. So again, we're operating under the assumption that this is at-will employment. So you can fire an employee at any time for any legal reason. But if they've engaged in some protected activities recently, you might want to step back. So I mentioned sick leave a little while ago. A lot of states have anti-retaliation statutes for the use of protected sick leave in your file. And so if an employee has used sick leave in the past 30 days or even 90 days in some states, there is a legal presumption that you are terminating their employment in retaliation and retribution for the use of their sick time. And you say, well, that's crazy. This has nothing to do with them being sick. But that's how the law is written. That's an advantage the employees have. Medical records and those types of things are off limits. You never want to utilize that as a reason for termination. So if someone says, my doctor said that I'm not going to be able to work for a month or two, or I might need to take maternity leave early. Maternity leave is a frequent question in Solution Center. You need to work with the employee and with their physician to see what you can do to accommodate if there's any disability accommodation. But you can't just look at the file and say, it says they're going to be out for 2 months. I can't do that. You're fired. Because you have the legal right to fire them at any time. But it is very easy for them to come back and say, this was inappropriate. This was a wrongful termination. So start by looking backwards. But when it comes to termination, what I like to advise my members is we will help, or an HR advisor will help with the legal risk associated with it, but look at the business consequences as well. That's something which is often overlooked. Can you make do without this employee? Are you going to need to hire a temporary employee to fill in? Are you expecting other employees to pitch in and fill the gap? Is that going to lead to overtime? There are a lot of practical considerations before terminating an employee that get overlooked, and never make the decision to terminate an employee in the heat of the moment. You might have your feelings, you might have your emotions about whether they're a good person or a good fit, but any termination is a purely business decision that must be made with a cool and rational approach, because the second you say you're fired in anger, they are fired. You don't need any formal paperwork to terminate an employee in most states, but you can't unsay it, either A, because they know that they've been terminated, or B, if you backtrack after making a statement like that, you lose a lot of respect and a lot of cachet with your other employees, because your ultimate trump card of I can fire you because I'm your boss has now been devalued. So be careful and be mindful, be in a good place, look at as many factors as possible, minimize risk as much as you can. But termination is an important tool in the HR toolkit for a successful practice.
So as far as when you're having a practice that is gotten past the exit of an employee, and you've successfully done it without fear of lawsuit or anything like that, what are some lessons that people should take internally of number one, that I think that the last tip you gave is fantastic about not being too quick to make a judgment. Take some time, get your ducks in a row, call them into the office, say we've decided to no longer continue your employment, or is that the right words to say? I don't want to say the wrong word again. Tell me what you say to somebody in that firing moment. Like what is it you specifically say? Is that fine? We've decided to quit, to no longer continue your employment with our company. You have here's your benefits that you were promised upon termination, and best of luck to you. I mean, or what word should they say?
Yep, no, that's a great question. So the one thing to start with is to note you don't have to say anything, and a lot of our members will want to do that, especially new members, to say, well, I don't need to give a reason for firing this person, so I'm just going to walk into their office and say, this isn't working out, you're fired. And that is legal. You can absolutely 100% do that. But I would not recommend doing that there, because if you don't give a reason, they will make up a reason. And if they have any way to make up an illegal reason, like, oh, I must have been fired because of my race, or because I took some sick leave recently, then they are going to try to utilize that. So step one is give a reason, but step two, do not over elaborate. And you want to use performance as your metric whenever possible, especially if you have previous write-ups or corrective actions in the file to say your performance has been a problem. And if you go to the employee and say, we've reviewed the metrics that we have in front of us here, and we've decided that we need to separate and sever your employment at this time. You've not been meeting our performance standards as we've discussed on previous occasions. We wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors. You can keep it as short and as sweet as that, but you are saying these performance-related problems, which we have addressed previously, are now grounds for your immediate termination of employment. Now, that's important. You can let them go immediately and without notice, and I would usually recommend that you do so, but pre-plan it. So there's a difference between going to the employee and saying, we got to let you go, but I'm going to do it in 2 weeks, versus planning 2 weeks previously to let them go that day. Because if you tell an employee, I am firing you in 2 weeks, nothing good is going to come in those next 2 weeks there. And you might think you're doing them a favor. You might think, I'm giving them time to prepare, to say their goodbyes, to start the job hunt. At best, they are going to slack off in terms of their performance. At worst, they may do something like throw their back out mysteriously, picking up some files to make it difficult or impossible for you to fire them. So make sure that you have a plan. Be short and sweet in the termination meeting and have it in writing. And you might say, Chris, you said earlier, I don't have to have it in writing. No, you don't. You can go into their office and say they're fired, but you want to have backup documentation which reinforces and elaborates on the reasons for termination to some extent. And I would give that to them at the time of termination. And even more than that, I would give them their final paycheck, including all amounts due and payable, that you may have from your vacation or your sick leave policies, certainly all of the wages and bonuses that they've earned at the time of termination. Certain states like California require that you do that. So it can be very difficult to fire someone in anger because you have to cut them a check then and there. Most states won't do that. But if you give them a final paycheck on their final day, especially as the termination is unexpected, it lessens the psychological blow and makes it more likely that the termination will go as smoothly as possible with as few wrinkles as possible.
Perfect. I like it. So before we wrap up, what are some other common issues you find young dentists run into when it comes to HR in general?
Sure. What I find is that, especially if you're fresh out of your medical training or your residency or those types of things there, you have put an enormous amount of effort and time and energy into becoming a professional. And so what I find new members doing especially is expecting that all other employees are going to have those same high efficiency standards, those same work ethic and drive standards there. And you have to understand that that's not going to be the case. And if you are picturing purchasing a practice and saying, I can run this more efficiently, production is going to double in 2 or 3 months because I know the system, or I'm going to do these things, or I'm going to crack the whip, it's not going to work. You are going to work very hard, but you're going to have to do it because everyone else will quit under you. So be reasonable with your expectations for performance. Be reasonable with your expectations for how employees are going to adjust to the new normal of you being the boss. And one way that you can help them adjust is through good write-ups, or what we call corrective actions here at Cedar. And what I find a lot of new members doing is treating these as a form of punishment. So let's say you have an employee who's on their cell phone all the time, and you've spoken to them many times in the past about the fact that Facebook has a time and a place, but on my clock in front of my patients is neither the time nor the place. That is a problem behavior. That is something that we want to amend. But if you go in with a write-up that says you are on your phone again, if this happens again, you're fired, you are missing an opportunity to help have them self-correct. And that's what a good write-up is going to do, because yes, it does act as a form of documentation. So you can look back and say, I warned you several times about this, and now I'm terminating you. But a good write-up is meant to be something that is a one and done, because you lay it out to explain why the behavior is a problem, what your reasonable expectations are in the future, and what the consequences are going to be. So give them the tools that they need to self-correct the behavior, because the best write-up that I can give my members is the one I only have to give once. One final point. I said something about multiple write-ups in the past, and a lot of members may say, oh yeah, we have a 3 strikes policy, or we have an if-then policy where we start with a verbal and then we go to a written or a final written warning. Remember, anything you do which suggests or implies that employees are entitled to something before they can be terminated jeopardizes the employer-employee relationship as an at-will status. So do not have a 3 strikes policy. Do not say we will always go verbal, written, final termination. You need to be able to do these in any order as many times as you want to get the result that's right for you. So what I like to joke is, if you catch an employee stealing and it's only their first offense, do you want to give them 2 more strikes?
It was only $5,000 was the first time, you know.
We found this time.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, no, that's a perfect example. I mean, because if you know, yeah, there's definitely first strike offenses that you'd want them to be out the door one way or the other. I could think some pretty humorous ones that may not be appropriate for podcast land. But so okay, so I love all those steps. You've given some really good ones today. You know, as far as setting up this process inside of the practice, inside of the business in general, now having all these tools available and ready to go at a moment's notice, so that's number one, it's not overbearing, because a lot of new business owners, man, they got a lot on their plate.
and adding in extra processes, extra forms, all these things you got to sign, all these, you got to keep a file for people. Where do I put it? Is it put it in a computer? Do I put it on a Dropbox? Do I put it in an actual manila envelope? All these things that get set up. What is a way for people to get started down this path, being able to have this process-driven practice in the HR department set up and ready to go for them? What's a way for them to be able to move forward with that in a simple and effective manner?
Sure. Well, certainly I'm going to say that Cedar can be a facilitator for you there. So we do offer free consultations for employee handbooks. If you want to send us the policies that you have or certain things that you may want us to review, we'll absolutely do it free of charge, and we'll tell you where there can be areas of risk or non-compliance. So let me give you an example. I guarantee that most of your listeners have something akin to this in their policies right now. Something like, employees may not share their wages with each other. If employees do, they will be subject to termination. And you may say, well, I've always seen that. I've always been subject to that. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because it's illegal. Under the National Labor Relations Act, employees have a right to discuss their wages, their working conditions, benefit, and management with each other, and that's called protected concerted activity and is a form of limited speech protection within your practice. But if you've always had that in your handbook or always had that as a policy, you don't know what you don't know. And so working with professionals, be it Cedar or be it with other wonderful companies out there, is a great idea. Or if you are in the process of hiring someone that is going to be versed in HR, check their credentials. Are they certified? Do they have the knowledge base that they need for your state and even your city increasingly to make sure that they are going to run things effectively? Because what I see a lot of the times is, I believe it's called the Peter principle, where you just have an employee from day one who's been with you for so long that they keep getting promoted, and then eventually they become the office manager or the HR person, and they don't know what they're doing. They are incredibly good people, but they're not great at HR. So a lot of people think HR is a back burner issue. And just like anything, it's not a problem until it's a problem. But seeking out professional counseling or guidance beforehand, setting things up if you're going to purchase a practice or acquire a new practice or transition into a practice, very, very helpful, be it from Cedar or from someone else there, because there's too much out there for you to know. It is impossible to have your finger on the pulse of things which are coming. So work with professionals whenever possible. And simply, if you take nothing else away from this, have it in writing. Because again, the cardinal rule of HR is if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So start making those files, start making those amendments about different policies you may want to have, start writing down the times where you correct problem behavior to save yourself a lot of grief and hassle on the back end. A little bit of front end work never hurts.
Sounds a lot like substantiation for deductions and expenses for the IRS. If there's not a receipt, then it didn't happen, or they can say that it didn't happen.
And you can say, well, maybe they won't call me on it, but in the back of your mind, you really want to have it in case they do.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, I appreciate you coming on today. If anyone needs to have, wants a follow-up question, if they want to reach out and, learn more about Cedar or yourself in general, what is a way for them to be able to do so?
Sure. You can contact me directly. It's Chris, CHRIS, at Cedar, CEDR, solutions with an S.com. So Chris at cedarsolutions.com. And if I don't reach out to you, one of my colleagues or associates will be happy to help.
Very cool. Chris, you've been a wealth of information. We appreciate you coming on today. And guys out there, this is an important lessons today. You don't want to get in trouble with the IRS, but you really don't want to get in trouble with a lawsuit. There's nothing less fun or more stressful than a lawsuit. We help people that have been audited before, and I would much rather be audited than to be sued. Litigation is not fun in any shape, form, or fashion. It's just a giant drain. It's a money suck, and with the way the current legislative environment is, unfortunately, sometimes it's better just to pony up than to actually even fight sometimes if you don't have like literally every duck in a row.
And
You are right there. It's oftentimes a matter of how quickly can I settle this? Because ultimately, if it goes to litigation, you've already lost, and you might want to cut your losses sooner than later and save that expense. It's not a moral argument. It's not a philosophical argument. This is a pure financial argument most of the time.
Yeah, tough. So guys out there, thanks so much for listening today. We've had a great episode. Chris, thanks again for coming on. Thanks to Cedar for allowing you, for having you come on. And we will see you guys next time. Bye, guys.
Thanks so much.
And so that's it for today, Ambitious Dentist. Again, I'm Jonathan Van Horn, CPA and ABV. I'll see you next week with another world-class practice owner or consultant that will help you start your very own dental practice.